Hello, everyone who's here. So I'm very excited today to introduce Dan Yourobsky, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at CMU. He is in the psychology department, so this is going to be a little bit different than our normal colloquiums where we have people in the CS department, but I believe you got your undergrad in CS, right? So Dan knows about computational things as well, and a lot of that will probably show in his presentation today, or some of that anyway. And so prior to his appointment at CMU, he was an assistant professor at University of Chicago and a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University. And he received his PhD in cognitive science from Indiana University and his BS in computer and cognitive science from CMU. So this is also familiar here. So the reason why I know Dan is because we spoke and started collaborating on some projects that kind of fall at the border of computer science, or well, more on the computer science side, but also incorporate some elements where we need to think about psychology. So it's been great interacting with him, and this is the first time I'm hearing his actual presentation. I've read his papers, but not seen him present before, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about his work. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dan.
Thanks so much, Graham. So thanks for having me. I'm excited to present to you guys. As Graham said, I was a computer scientist, roughly 10 to 15 years ago. So, you'll see that my knowledge of computational stuff is roughly 10 to 15 years old. So, the computation probably won't be cutting edge, but I'm hoping I'll have something to say to you guys that you'll find interesting too. Okay, so today I want to tell you about some work that we've been doing in my lab, thinking about how it is that kids are so good at language learning. And the story I'm going to tell you is that at least some of what's going on is that they're getting input from their parents and caregivers and other people that's basically coordinated to their development in a way that supports learning. So I think a lot about how kids learn words. There's lots that is interesting about that. One thing that I think is particularly interesting is just how quickly it happens. So I'm showing you here a plot of age in months on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the number of words in the productive vocabulary of the 50th percentile child. So, all I want to say is this goes up a lot. To give you a sense of scale here, this same median child will get potty trained right around the 28-month mark, already producing almost 1,000 distinct words, right? So that's pretty incredible, actually, given all of the other stuff that's happening developmentally with this kiddo. And the way that a lot of us have thought about language learning historically, at least folks who have been computationally inclined in psychology, and my guess is to some extent in machine learning, is to think about language learning as some kind of information processing problem. So the idea is there's this kid and he's hearing some stuff and he's seeing some stuff, and these things go into the black box in his head, and out comes this impressive vocabulary development. And so our the thing we're trying to study scientifically is the kid, right? The kid is the language learning system. And so, at some schematic level, do this, you think about word learning as a kind of statistical inference process. So this is from a paper by Jeff Siskind, who did early influential work of this kind in psychology, but there's lots of stuff like this. So basically, you're hearing utterances, you're making observations, those get transformed into some representational system, and they get mapped onto, and you're trying to infer this thing called the lexicon, which is the relationship between word forms and things in the world, basically. And the reason this works at all is that if we ever, often talk about the things that are around us, then it should be the case that words co-occur with the objects that they refer to typically, in which case, if you track those co-occurrences, you can learn something about word meanings. So, roughly what you're trying to do is learn something like, the joint probability of the word truck and this thing here is different from the product of the independent probabilities, something like that. And there's work showing that even pretty young infants can do something sort of like this. So I'm showing you here an experiment from Linda Smith and Chen Yu. What they did was they showed 12 and 14-month-old infants displays like this. So these are just PowerPoint shapes and some kind of made up words. And the idea is that each individual trial is ambiguous. So you don't know whether the green thing is the BOSA or the red thing is the BOSA, or the green thing is the gasser or the red thing is the gasser, and so on. And you do this over and over and over again for about 5 minutes. And each individual exposure is ambiguous. And then what you do at the end is you show kids these two things on the screen and you play them the sound BOSA and you measure where they look. And the idea is if they've learned something about the correspondence between the word BOSA and one of these shapes rather than the other as a function of the co-occurrence, they should prefer to look at the thing that has co-occurred more frequently with the word BOSA than the thing that has occurred less frequently with the word BOSA. And indeed, that's what happens. So I'm showing you here their plot of 12 and 14-month-old looking times to the target, which is the thing that actually is the BOSA, here the red thing, versus the other object, which is not the BOSA. And it turns out 12 and 14-month-old infants reliably discriminate the more frequent co-occurring object from the less frequent co-occurring object. So this works more or less, but it turns out to be a less powerful mechanism for humans, at least, than you might hope is the case. So I'm going to show you some data from work that Mike Frank and I did. I'm going to leave out most of the details, but you can take this as basically a measure of the bandwidth of this kind of learning strategy here in adults. It ends up being even worse for kids, as you might predict. You can take the gap between the red and the blue line as basically the bandwidth of this kind of statistical co-occurrence tracking. So the red line is basically remembering something you just saw in no ambiguity. And the blue line is the effective ambiguity, like you were seeing there 2 objects at a time. So this is the gap for 2 objects at a time. And we looked at 3, 4, and 8, and you can see it gets pretty big. So in all cases, adults here track these distributional structures. So, they're above chance here, which is the dotted line, but just barely. Right, so the strategy is really bandwidth limited, even in adults who, aren't having to pull these words out of continuous speech signals and figure out, these objects from a set of many. Even then, it's pretty hard, and it ends up being even harder for kids. And so the question is, well, why is it that kids are so good at word learning if it seems like this, at least this kind of strategy for word learning is so bandwidth limited? And what I want to try to do is to get you to think about learning language not as learning kind of a statistical inference problem, but as learning to communicate. So I want to motivate this by saying we do a lot of asking parents what their kids know in psychology. So if you ask the parent of a 12-month-old or a 28-month-old if they know the word bottle, it's quite likely that their parent will say yes, they do. But when this child down here uses the word bottle, she probably in fact says bottle. But as a 12-month-old, it's actually much more likely that she says baba or something else that's not bottle. And so the question is, to what extent does she know the meaning of the word bottle? How can it be that they both know the word bottle? And the answer is, they're not trying to learn a correspondence between words and objects. What they're trying to learn is a signal that they can send to somebody else that other person will interpret in a sort of desirable way, right? They're learning to solve goals with language. They're learning to communicate. And what we do in my lab is think about how much that kind of structure of a communicative problem, especially with someone who's a supportive caregiver, can change the difficulty or ease of language learning. So you can think about kind of input that you're getting on some continuum of optimality for language acquisition. So on the far left, you have this kind of adversarial structure of language input. So I don't know if folks here are familiar with Gould's theorem. This was the sort of formal version of Chomsky's theorem of the poverty of the stimulus, which is basically, imagine mom is Descartes' demon and she's trying to maximally confuse you about language. It turns out to be really hard to learn. On the far right side, you might have what you might think of as rational pedagogy. So your caregiver is trying to maximize your information gain about language, and they're trying to structure, language to you in that way. And in between, you have this big morass where what I call naive statistical learning, which is this kind of, I don't make any assumptions about the generating process. I just, associate things, live somewhere over here. And the argument that I want to make to you is that parents aren't trying to maximize their kids learning about language, but they are trying to maximize their communicative success with them, right? They're trying to get them to, stop crying or eat their dinner or tie their shoes or whatever. And that kind of tuning for communicative success can actually get you a fair amount of the way from this kind of naive statistical inference to rational pedagogy. It's maybe not quite as good, but it could be close, at least in some circumstances. And I want to make a distinction between two kinds of versions of this linguistic tuning hypothesis, where the tuning hypothesis is that language input changes over development in some way that supports learning. So you might imagine a coarse version of this hypothesis where basically parents are sensitive to something kind of general about their kids' language development, kind of roughly how many words they know or whether they know hard words or not, but maybe not the specifics of their language. Versus fine-tuning, where parents might have a really detailed model of what their kids know and don't know. It might tailor their language input according to this incredibly precise model. Well, maybe incredibly precise is too much, but fairly precise, right? Knowledge of their kids' level of knowledge of individual words. And this might be even better for language learning. So what I'm going to do in this talk is tell you about 3 projects. The first is going to be a demonstration of coarse tuning in this thing called linguistic alignment. So I'm going to show you that parents change the way they talk to their kids over development. Then I'll show you a model of fine-tuning in a simple reference game, and basically evidence that at least on Amazon Mechanical Turk, people seem to behave in accordance with this model that we wrote down. And then last, I'll show you some data that suggests that in at least a facsimile of real interactions, parents actually have and use this kind of fine-tuned linguistic knowledge. Okay, so the first project I want to tell you about is joint work with Joe Denby, Gabe Doyle, and Mike Frank. We're trying to figure out basically how to come up with a measure for how much parents tune their speech to their children, and then ask whether that matters for anything about language development. So I claim that it does, but it would be in fact nice to show that it does. So for this project, we used data from a big collection of parent-child speech interactions called Childs. It's mostly transcripts, but also some video and audio that Brian McWhinney, who's a colleague of mine in psychology, has kind of collated over the years. It's got lots of contributions from lots of different scientists of recordings for whatever their project happened to be that are all in a place where you can go in and ask questions about the input or the output of children in language development. So I'm just going to show you a short snippet of one of these clips because I think it's really cute and it'll demonstrate sort of what this data look like.
Some of this, do you know what that is? It is sweet potato. You're a bear that eats what? What do you
So this goes on like this, roughly as cutely ad infinitum. This is 20-month-old Naima, who's in, I think, the Brown corpus. If you go in and have a look at this resource, just talking to her mom about sort of whatever. So, it's pretty natural speech. This is, one particular parent and their one particular kid, but it doesn't look super stilted to me. It looks kind of roughly like what people talk to each other like. And what I'm going to do is just measure how often parents use words like that and this and some and a and more contingent on their child's use of that kind of word, and vice versa. So the reason that I'm going to focus on these kind of more function words is that, if you're talking about sweet potato or bear, you might not have that many ways you could talk about it. You might have to say sweet potato. Maybe eventually you can use pronouns, but the content is driving what you say, whereas in function words, you might have more freedom about whether to use them or not. And I'm just going to measure basically how often parents use these words contingent on their child's use and vice versa. So we're going to do things like, is mom more likely to use a quantifier if Naima just used a quantifier? Is mom more likely to use a preposition if Naima just used a preposition? Is mom more likely to use an impersonal pronoun, a word like it or that or these and so on, if Naima just used an impersonal pronoun? We borrowed these categories from Pennebaker. They're called the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count set. It's kind of a proprietary set of words that and categories that he's used in various work. Like they've got a cool version of this where they try to figure out, if Francis Bacon actually wrote some of Shakespeare on the basis of the use of these kinds of words and so on. We use them not because we think they have any particular importance to child development, but mostly because there's already a lot of degrees of freedom in this kind of analysis, and we figured we'd let someone else, solve this one. So basically, we just built a big model trying to estimate these contingencies. So, there are basically four kinds of things that can happen. One is that neither Naima nor her mom use one of these kinds of words, or Naima cannot produce a quantifier and mom's following utterance can include one, or Naima can use a quantifier and mom cannot include one in her following utterance, or they can both use one. And what we did is we basically just estimated two parameters that might govern the use of words like quantifiers. So one is just this base rate probability of using a quantifier, an impersonal pronoun, or whatever. We don't know what these are. They're a nuisance for us. It turns out, you use quantifiers less than you use determiners and so on. So we just need to estimate this to kind of, pull it out of the analysis. And then we estimated a second parameter, which is basically the increase or decrease in usage of one of these kinds of words if it just appeared in your conversational partner's previous utterance. So we want to ask, over and above your base rate usage of one of these word categories, are you now more likely to use it if your conversational partner just used it? This corpus that we looked at is kind of large, at least by psychology standards. I think obviously not at all by machine learning standards, but by our standards, pretty big corpus that's kind of sparse and heterogeneous. So I'm showing you here a dot plot of the number of transcripts we have for each particular child, at least in 2016 when we did this work. And you can see that there are some kids about whom we have a ton of information. So there are a couple corpora where kids were measured longitudinally really often for a long time, but then also other corpora where we have, one transcript for a particular kid. And so we want to do something that, tries to use all of this information. So there's prior work trying to estimate this kind of linguistic alignment earlier on, but folks didn't have a method that let you aggregate in a sensible way across multiple people. So there's work by this guy Sokolov in '93, which looked at these three particular kids. And there's slightly more recent work from Dale and Spivey looking at these three kids using this cool metric called cross-recurrence analysis. But none of these can integrate across kids. So when you find, you measure three kids and their parents and you find some individual differences, it's sort of hard to know what to say about that. You don't know if you're measuring something general or if it really is idiosyncratic across people. So we just did basically a big hierarchical Bayesian regression, which tries to estimate alignment on prepositions, which is, one instance of one of these many categories, and that's separate for each particular parent and their kid. And then, above that is the general parent level parameter. So we're trying to kind of estimate at every level of this hierarchy how much linguistic alignment you have. Okay, so let me show you what we find. We made this measure of linguistic alignment. We wanted to see whether it picked up on anything. One phenomenon that folks have found before with measures of linguistic alignment is that they're sensitive to conversational roles. And so we looked at this on Twitter. So I think probably all of you know this already. You can see that these slides are dated, but there are some folks on Twitter who are verified. So they're like actual important real world people, and Twitter reaches out and makes sure that the account that has their name actually belongs to that person. And there are other people like me who are not verified because, basically doesn't matter what an account with my name says on Twitter. And what you can see here is that people who are verified get lots of engagement. This is a joke I made in 2015 about this really like inside baseball psychology thing about speech segmentation, and basically no one thought it was funny, as you might predict. And we just asked whether people responding to folks who were verified versus responding to folks who were unverified align more to them. And so the intuition is that you should align more to people who are more powerful. So folks have found this in other kinds of analyses. We just wanted to see if it holds true on Twitter. And indeed it does. So when folks who are unverified like me reply to folks who are verified, we align more to them. We reuse more of their, parts of speech and quantifiers and so on, than when folks respond to unverified people when verified people respond to unverified people. So my colleague, Gabe Doyle, likes to say that basically we're asking if children are the celebrities of the family. And it turns out that they are. So I'm going to show you here what linguistic alignment looks like over development. So as a baseline measure, we got, mom aligning to dad, or dad aligning to cameraman, or whatever. These are adults talking to each other. And so you see a non-zero level of linguistic alignment. So this is just kind of a general feature of human interaction. We reuse a lot of each other's speech, either because of kind of low-level priming or high-level desire to assimilate or what have you. Here's what children look like over development. So just like adults, children, reuse some of their caregivers' speech. So they align some. We don't find a reliable difference over the course of development. It looks pretty similar to adult-adult alignment. But here's parents aligning to their children. And what we find is this pretty linear relationship. So this is estimated with linear regression, so that's why it looks so linear. But in fact, it is pretty linear. So parents start off aligning a ton to their young children, and then drop off over the course of development, presumably as children need kind of less scaffolding in these interactions. So we take this as evidence that something about parents' speech is changing over development. We also, because we estimated this model hierarchically, we can get individual parent-child estimates of alignment. So I'm showing you here estimates for Naima and her caregivers. So this is the kid whose video I showed you earlier. This looks a lot like the kind of population level trend, but there's some variability in this. So there's 6 other children in the little subcorpus that Naima's in. And you can see that there's a lot of consistency, but also some variability. So Violet's parents, for instance, don't align very much to her at all. And we predicted that this should, have some impact on children's development, but we couldn't really measure that in this data set because we don't have anything other than these transcripts to go on. So we took this to another data set. This is a big corpus collected by Susan Golden-Meadow and her colleagues at the University of Chicago. It's 60 kids kind of oversampled to be representative of the broader Chicagoland kind of racial and socioeconomic demographics. And it's longitudinal, so it's the same kid measured from 14 to 58 months in 4-month increments. And one thing that's exciting about this corpus is, in addition to being pretty diverse and longitudinal, it also has some externally valid outcome measures. So it has this thing called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which is like a validated measure of children's vocabulary development. It's basically an adaptive test where you show them 4 things and you say which one's the doll, and then if they get it right, you move to a harder item. If they get it wrong, you move to an easier item, and so on. We just wanted to ask, A, do we replicate this change in alignment in this corpus? And B, does it have anything to tell us about kids' Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test change? So we find, first of all, yes, we get a very similar trend in alignment. So kids align to their parents at non-zero levels. Parents align more to their kids early on and less over the course of development. And we also find that if you look at the relationship between parental alignment and how much kids gather vocabulary, you find that parents who change in alignment more have kids who get more words into their vocabulary over the same unit time. So we think this is suggestive that sensitivity to your kid's development and kind of production of language at the kind of right level of complexity is at least associated with development. And this holds even if you partial out other things that you think might matter, like parents' educational attainment or income or things like that. It's not the world's most robust correlation, but it holds up statistically. So we think it's at least consistent with the idea that alignment to children is helpful with facilitating their language development. And so, a critical feature of this is alignment isn't really an intentional thing that you're doing on purpose. It's just, sort of something that happens in the course of talking to your kid. But nonetheless, it seems to be helpful for language development, or so we think. So that was the first part of the talk. Maybe I'll pause here in case anyone has any questions about that. So I want to tell you next about a model that we wrote down of, what it might look like cognitively for you to be kind of adapting your speech to your kids' language development. So this is a project that's led by my grad student, Ben Morris. So what we did was we started with the same longitudinal corpus of parent-child interaction, and we just coded all of the concrete noun reference in the corpus. So it looks like this. You know, we have a whole bunch of utterances where the parent says things like, do you want to read a book quick? And child says, mommy, and so on. And we just coded in each of the gestural and spoken modalities, what are the concrete noun reference that get referred to either by speech or by gesture. So here the kid is holding up a necklace for mom to see, so we take that as kind of a deictic reference to the necklace. And we just looked at the frequency of these things. So here's a plot of rank frequency against frequency of the concrete nouns. So you get something that looks, you know, like you might expect, sort of relatively Zipfian. This top point up here is mom. So mom gets referred to a ton in the corpus, whereas things like wind chime and cauliflower are less frequent. And what we wanted to know was, are parents more likely to do both of these kinds of references simultaneously? So to both say the name of something and point to it as a function of its frequency? And what you find is that parents are sensitive to both their kid's age and the frequency of the thing they're referring to in choosing to do this kind of, you know, really ostensive kind of pointing to a thing and saying its name at the same time, which is like kind of an optimal learning signal. So what you find is parents do this a lot for infrequent things, especially for young children, right? So this looks like a kind of adaptation to teaching your kid things that you think they're not likely to know. And the question is, well, how could you get this to arise? Well, one possibility is that it's driven by kind of altruistic teaching goals, like parents are trying to maximize their kids' learning. We wanted to see if you could get the same kind of thing to emerge from kind of more proximal communicative goals. So the idea is you can think about whether this kind of signal can emerge from a kind of iterated coordination game. So, you know, schematically, you imagine, you know, the parent here is trying to talk to their child about one of these two things that's in front of them, and maybe they want to talk about the shallot rather than the artichoke. Well, what could they do? One thing they could do is they could say the word shallot, and that's great if your kid knows what a shallot is. Maybe less good if they don't. They could definitely point. Pointing is pretty good. You know, it's a little more kind of energetically costly. It only works if you're already looking in the same area, but it's okay. It doesn't matter if your child doesn't know it. Or they could do both at the same time. This is like you're paying an extra cost. You wouldn't want to, you know, do both communicative modalities if you could avoid it. But the upshot of this is, you know, later on down the line, if they learn that this is a shallot, then you could communicate more efficiently in the future, because if we think that speaking is less energetically or, you know, cognitively or whatever costly than pointing, then you could speak in the future because now maybe it's more likely your child knows the word shallot. And so the idea is that you might get this kind of ostensive labeling to emerge out of a kind of discounted desire to have more effective communication in the future, which is basically teaching, but kind of for your own sake, right? Just so you can kind of communicate better in the future. So, I see maybe someone has a question. There's a question about whether these results hold across, you know, the socioeconomic strata, or whether the vocab test holds across, is like equally valid across socioeconomic strata. Oh, well, thanks thanks for saying that. So, you know, it's only 60 kids. So, you know, the subset analyses are sort of, you know, hard to do. So alignment does change as a function of socioeconomic development as we can measure it. We measured it continuously rather than kind of subgrouping. So, you know, we try to control for that and then ask whether this measure, is still predictive of language development. This PPVT measure is valid across socioeconomic and racial groups, so that's good. I think this alignment measure is, but you know, that's a new measure that I invented, so you should be more skeptical about that. PPVT is good. Lots of other people have used it before. Okay, so you can think about this kind of communication as kind of like a planning under uncertainty. So you can model it as basically a POMDP. So the idea is, you know, when you're trying to figure out what modality you should use, whether you should speak or point or do both, what you want to do is basically maximize the expected utility of taking the action, given your beliefs about your partner's vocabulary. And so that's going to be a function of the utility of taking the action given their vocabulary, plus some discounted expected utility that you might get in the future of taking actions in the future, given, new beliefs you have about their vocabulary. But the problem is you don't actually know your conversational partner's vocabulary. All you have is kind of a noisy estimate of it that you have from prior interactions with them. So what you can do is you can kind of average over the expected vocabulary you expect your communicative partner to have, given the probability of, the actions that they've taken in the past under different vocabulary. So given the probability that your belief assigns. And here we say just the utility you get for taking actions is, 1 minus the cost you pay for using the modality. So you pay some cost for pointing. You pay a cost for speaking that's lower than the cost for pointing, and you get no utility if your conversational partner doesn't know the word. So if you say shallot and they don't know what that means, then that's no good. They don't know what you mean and they don't get the right referent. And to teach, you have to pay the cost of both of these things. So it's really costly today, but it might bear fruit in the future if you're going to keep interacting over and over and over again. So you make a plan that tries to maximize expected utility. Then you take an action by sampling from actions given their expected utilities. You say the word shallot. It turns out your kid has no idea what the word shallot is, so you get an observation that lets you update your beliefs, and then you update your beliefs accordingly. So I'm going to skip the details here mostly, but basically the idea is that the new vocabulary is if you thought they knew something before, you assume they still do unless you get disconfirming evidence. If you teach, you think that there's some chance they might learn. I'm going to leave out the details of what you think that chance is, but feel free to ask me later. And otherwise, if you used a word and it turns out they don't know what you're talking about, then you infer that they probably don't know what that word means. So we wrote down this model, and I'll show you in a minute its predictions. So what we did was we had Amazon Mechanical Turkers play an experimental version of this kind of reference game, where their goal was to get their partner to pick one of these things, either using language or using a kind of facsimile to pointing. So we pre-trained them on made up labels for these things in different frequencies, which ends up mattering in a way that I'm going to skip the details of. But basically they did some pre-learning, so they knew what some of these things were called. And then they could either use language, so they could type the name for this thing into the box. And then the cost for that was low across conditions. And so you would get, say, 80 points if the cost of using speech was 20 points. If your partner, in fact, knows what DAX means. If they don't, then they get it wrong and you don't get any points. You can point by clicking on the thing. So this is unambiguous. It doesn't matter whether your partner knows the label for this thing, but you have to pay more points, so you'd rather not do it. So here you pay 50 points to click, and so you only get 50 points for getting your partner to guess the right thing. Or you can do both of them at the same time. You can click on it and you can type into the box. And that's like a kind of teaching signal, but now you have to pay the cost for doing both of these things. So it's kind of the least efficient thing to do right now. And the question is, will people behave in this task in a reasonable way, where reasonable is defined by my model of communicating as planning under uncertainty. So we manipulated how many times people thought their partner had been exposed to each of these things. We told them, you got exposed to the labels for these things 21 times. Your partner either saw them as much as you did, or half as often as you did, or not at all. And the intuition was basically you should use language when you think your partner is likely to know what words mean, and not so much when you think they shouldn't. And maybe you should be especially likely to teach them when you think they don't know anything, and you're going to communicate with them again in the future. So we told them they play for each object 3 times. So you should, teach a lot maybe early on and less later on. And what we did was we varied a bunch of things, one of which was kind of the relative efficiency of speech and pointing. So pointing could be more or less costly, and speech could be more or less costly. We wanted to make sure people were, sensitive to these utility differences, because if they're not, then, all the rest of this like complicated recurrence, we don't have much to say about it. But it turns out people are. So I'm plotting for you here people's propensity to use speech or pointing or to teach as a function of how many times we told them their partner had been exposed to the language in higher efficiency and lower efficiency conditions. And so what you see is people, speak a lot when speaking is relatively cheap. and point a lot when when speaking is relatively costly, and also tend to teach people who they think are less likely to know language and don't teach people who they think know the same amount as them. And we also get these differences like you should predict. So you're likely to teach the first time you encounter an object in this game and less likely the third time. And you're more likely to teach people who have the same amount of language as you, and less likely to teach people who you think know, you're more likely to teach people who know less than you, some amount likely to teach people who know the same amount of you, and very unlikely to teach people who you think know more than you. And it turns out people's behavior is pretty well predicted by this model that we wrote down. So, at least in this kind of toy context, it looks like you can model people's communicative choices as a kind of planning under uncertainty. So you can model people's communicative choices in this game as a kind of planning under uncertainty. And if people did this in the real world, then you would get this kind of pedagogically supportive language input as a function of just desire to kind of communicate, rather than any kind of additional altruistic teaching signal. So we've done some simulations that you can go here and play around with if you want. There's a Shiny app that you can drag sliders around in and manipulate things like the cost of pointing or how rational the teacher is and so on. And we want to know basically where does this kind of communicative partner fall in the range between an indifferent partner and a partner that's trying to maximize your learning. And it turns out it's pretty close to rational pedagogy under a lot of parameter settings, manipulate kind of how smart the learner is and communicate with you, than being really good at doing statistical inference. So we think this is at least a proof of concept that having a communicative partner actually can do a lot of the work for you in trying to get language learning done. That's the end of the second part of the talk. Maybe, how much longer should I talk? Okay, all right, let me tell you about this last part where we tried to actually see if parents do something that this model would predict, right? So we wrote down this kind of model that we like a lot and showed that mechanical Turkers do something that is at least reasonably well predicted by it, but it would be nice to show that parents actually do something like this. So this is work that's led by my grad student, Ashley Long, and Alex Tunkel, who is a former honors student in my lab. So what we did was we wanted to know whether parents will actually fine-tune the way they talk to their kids based on what they think children know. So we had them play this game where they try to get their children to pick animals from a set. We used this set of animal drawings that's kind of been handed down through psychology. It was first developed by Snodgrass and Vanderwoord, and then later colorized by Roysson and Portois. It's normed for all kinds of nice visual features and so on. We used animals because it turns out we have pretty good data about kind of how early versus late kids learn various animals on average. So I'm showing you here data from the Word Bank project, which is a project that some collaborators and I have done, putting together basically there's this standard form called the Macarthur Child Development Inventory, which we give parents and ask, does your kid know this word? Do they know this word? Do they know this other word, across a bunch of different lexical categories? That's also been externally validated and that people have used in all kinds of different languages and different contexts. And so we've put a bunch of these forms together. You can go here and play around with some nice visualizations or download the data if you want. I'm showing you here the proportion of kids whose parents report that they know each of these 4 animals across this range of months. And so what you see is, as you might predict, kids tend to learn the word dog relatively early, whereas they learn the word donkey relatively late. So probably everyone knew that already, but we can quantify sort of actually, the kind of rate of dog acquisition versus donkey acquisition with this data. So we chose animals that vary in how quickly children tend to acquire them. And we had kids and parents play a game like this, where the kid would have an iPad that has 3 animals on it, like you're seeing here. And the parent on each trial would have a word pop up on their iPad. And we asked them to just, sort of say whatever they wanted to get their kid to pick the correct target animal. Then kids would tap on one of the animals on the iPad. It would make a hopefully pleasing sound like that. And then it would move on to the next trial. And so about a week before parents and kids came into the lab, we sent them home like a kind of a digital version of a short form of this Macarthur Child Development Inventory. So just asking them, we just want to know how many words your kid knows. Can you click on all of these that your kid knows? And we embedded the animals in this. So it's not all animals, it's the kind of standard form plus the animals. Sorry, I see there's a question, so I'm just gonna have a look at that real quick. Why are the animals the same size? Good question. Yeah, maybe we should have scaled them to their real world size. There's actually some cool evidence that this matters. So people are, slightly slower to identify things that are mismatched to their real size. I don't know. We thought that maybe kids would be more likely to pick larger animals independent of what the parents said. But it's a good question. That's maybe a useful thing to think about. Okay, yeah. So thanks for your, thanks Sricharan about your enthusiasm for the cross-linguistic and cross-cultural data. I hope you go have a look at it. It's pretty fun to play around with. Okay, so we got parents to make judgments about their kids. And then just to show you, these recapitulate basically our expectations. So I'm showing you here for each of these animals, the proportion of parents of the 2.5-year-olds we measured who reported that they knew the word cat, dog, and so on. And so you can see that, as you might predict, cat and dog and cow are known by basically every 2.5-year-old, whereas the words we predicted should be harder, in fact, are harder. So, not so many kids knew swan or lobster or leopard and so on. And so what we wanted to know is basically, do parents talk differently about animals that are, on this side of the knowledge plot versus animals that are on this side. So the prediction here was if parents' referring expressions are tuned to their children's knowledge, they should produce more informative referring expressions for harder words. So they should give more information to help their kid pick swan and less information to help get them to pick dog. And also they should update their beliefs in response to their children's behavior. So, if you thought your kid knew the word swan, but it turns out they don't, you should, update your beliefs about that and talk differently about swan next time. So we had them play twice for each animal so we could get a measure on this. So let me just show you what this looks like. So this is one particular parent-child dyad just for these 2 trials in a row. This goes by pretty quickly, but just so you can see, sort of roughly what the task is like.
Where's the horsey? Hey, horsey! Where's the one that's like the cat?
Okay, so what we did was we just measured the length of parents' utterances, because that's a pretty theory agnostic measure of information. We also measured a bunch of other kind of descriptive things, like whether they use descriptors like color or size or comparisons or references to the cat they have at home or whatever, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to show you an analysis of the length of parents' referring expressions. And what we find, as we predicted, is that parents produce reliably longer referring expressions for animals that kids tend to learn late. So they produce more words when trying to get their kid to pick swan and fewer words when they're trying to get them to pick cat. So, in aggregate across all of the children are more likely to know cat than swan. And so parents in aggregate are more likely to say more words for swan. So we take this as a measure of kind of calibration. But remember, we got this measure for every individual parent and their kid. So we can regress out the kind of general propensity to use more words for harder animals and ask over and above that, do parents take into account their individual kids' individual knowledge? And we find that they do. So over and above the kind of aggregate using more words for swan, we find that parents produce more words for animals that they reported a week earlier they think their kid doesn't know, relative to animals that they think their kid does know. So this is like pretty fine tuning, right? So parents could have a bad model of their kid, but whatever their model of their kid is, they leverage it in a pretty specific way in this kind of referential task. So it's not to do teaching, it's just to do reference, but they take into account what their kid knows about individual animals. And then we asked whether they update their beliefs as well. So I'm showing you here that parents produce more informative referring expressions for words that kids are less likely to know. Let me show you now that they actually update their beliefs too. So they played with each animal twice. So here's the first time each animal appeared. This is the pattern I just showed you. If kids were correct on the first trial of each animal, you get this exact same pattern. So parents are more likely to produce more words for unknown animals relative to known animals. But if it turns out kids guess incorrectly, like parents thought they knew swan, they said whatever they needed to say to get swan picked, and then the kid picked the lobster instead of the swan. The second time around, those animals that parents thought their children knew, they treat just like animals they thought their children didn't know. So this is like recalibration of their model in response to this observable behavior. So again, we take this as evidence that parents have pretty well specified models of their kids' language development, like down to the individual lexical item. And they update these models and they leverage them in producing referring expressions to their kids. So this is a pretty precise level of tuning. I'll show you here just some early data from another project that Ashley and Ben are working on. We're interested in whether kids have the same kind of knowledge as well. So, you know, it's well and good if your parent has a really detailed level of knowledge about your language development, but if actually your older sibling is doing most of the language input to you, then, you know, who cares? Maybe that doesn't matter so much. So we're interested in whether older children reason about younger children's language knowledge in the same kinds of way and leverage that language knowledge like parents do. We don't have the communication data, but let me just show you this task where we asked children between the ages of 4 and 8 to reason about this 2.5-year-old made-up kid, Sam. We just asked them, do you think Sam is likely to know the word for turtle, yes or no? They would, you know, say yes or no, and then we would say, are you not so sure, a little sure, or very sure? Or, you know, the same for not knowing, and this let us construct a 6-point kind of knowledge estimation scale from I'm very sure my this 2.5-year-old is unlikely to know turtle to I'm certain this 2.5-year-old is likely to know turtle. And we looked at this over development. So let me show you that here. So I'm showing you on the x-axis adults' judgments of the age at which children tend to learn words. And on the y-axis here, children's judgments about the likelihood that this 2-year-old knows these particular animals. And what you find is, so first of all, 8-year-olds look basically just like adults. 8-year-olds have like an incredibly precise level of you know, knowledge about which of these words are learned earlier, and therefore are good at judging whether, you know, this 2-year-old is likely to know leopard versus dog. And you see that this improves over development. And even 4-year-olds have some statistical information about, you know, the likelihood that this 2-year-old will know each of these animal words. It's actually grounded in reality. So this isn't yet evidence that these same children, you know, leverage this knowledge in communicating with younger children. But it's at least evidence that they have the knowledge that they could use to kind of tune their communicative signals. And that's what we're investigating now. So I wanted to show you today some evidence that parents tune the language that children hear to their developmental level. I showed you first this model of linguistic alignment, which shows that you get this kind of coarse tuning of reusing of children's function words over development. I showed you a model of how you might get teaching to emerge from kind of planning in an iterative communication game, and you might think about language as basically just being an iterated communication game. And then finally, I showed you some evidence that parents have pretty precise models of their kids' language development and leverage these models when they talk to their kids. You know, you probably have noticed this. These are like pretty culturally specific contexts. We're playing reference games on iPads and we're doing animal naming. That's on purpose, right? So I pick paradigms to use that I think are going to be culturally valid in the culture that I study. And obviously, you know, it's an open question to what extent this will generalize beyond this sample, but I think some version of this is pretty likely to, because while the contexts are undoubtedly culturally specific, I think the mechanism here is pretty universal, that the pressure to communicate is going to be there in, you know, every society or culture you can imagine. You know, it might be that siblings are doing more talking to kids, or grandparents are doing more talking to kids, and those people might have models of different fidelity about those kids, but the pressure should be the same. And so the same general thing should hold up. I think this both because there's lots of cool evidence from folks like Ted Gibson that communicative pressure actually explains a lot about cross-linguistic regularities in language structure. and also that it looks like language directed to children rather than overheard by children is predictive of language learning across cultures. So both across socioeconomic strata in the US and in, for instance, work in Mayan culture, which is quite different from ours by Laura Schneiden. I guess the goal here is to try to convince you that you should think about the language that kids get as being tuned to facilitate communication to them, and that tuning for communication might actually get you a fair amount of the way towards tuning for learning, even though it's not the same thing. So let me just thank you and thank my funders, and I'd be very happy to take more questions.
Okay, thank you.